Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really embarking on a fascinating exploration into ayahuasca and its effects on mental well-being.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
It is. We've gathered a range of sources, scientific studies, big literature reviews, and our mission really is to pull out the key insights. How might this traditional brew influence things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, even eating disorders, and substance abuse?
And just general well-being too, right? It's not only about disorders.
Exactly. And personality, mindfulness, it covers a lot of ground. So get ready, because we're about to unpack quite a bit of intriguing info.
Absolutely. And what's so compelling, I think, is seeing these ancient practices examined through the lens of modern science now.
Right.
We're not just looking at the chemicals in ayahuasca, we're also looking at the whole context, the rituals, the setting, the person's mindset.
And setting,
It really seems like all these things are intertwined. Our goal here is to sort of distill from these sources what the potential benefits might be, and maybe more importantly, the mechanisms, what's actually driving these effects.
Okay, so let's dive right into a really thought-provoking study first. This one's from Maastricht University.
Yes.
And it tried to answer a pretty fundamental question. These mental health improvements people report after ayahuasca retreats, are they really because of the ayahuasca itself?
Or is it more about that set and setting, the expectations, the whole retreat vibe?
Exactly.
That's such a critical question, isn't it? Because, lots of earlier studies showed positive stuff linked to ayahuasca, but without a proper control.
Right. How do you know?
It's hard to isolate what the substance itself is doing. So this study, it took a big step, a placebo-controlled trial, but crucially within actual ayahuasca retreats.
Yeah, across the Netherlands, Spain, Germany. They got experienced ayahuasca users who were already signed up for these retreats, and then they randomly split them. One group got capsules with actual ayahuasca.
Okay.
The other got a placebo. And it wasn't just like a sugar pill. It was this clever mix. Cocoa powder, vitamins, turmeric, quinoa.
Sounds almost healthy.
Right. Even coffee traces, potato flour.
Oh.
Really designed to mimic something happening.
That's a smart placebo design. Makes the comparison much stronger, because it's not obviously inert. So what did they find?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Both groups, the ayahuasca group and the placebo group, they both reported lower symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress after the ceremony.
Both groups. Wow.
Yeah.
So that points pretty strongly towards a placebo effect, or at least the power of the setting, doesn't it?
It really does. It just underscores how influential that whole context can be. The intention, the group support, maybe just taking a break from normal life.
Yeah, all those non-pharmacological factors. It makes you wonder, like you said, how much of any therapy's effectiveness, even standard ones, is tied up in these things we don't always measure.
Totally. It strongly suggests that even without the specific ayahuasca chemistry, just the belief, the intentional space, the shared ritual, that can have a real impact on well-being.
But wait, the study didn't stop there, did it? Were there any effects specific to the ayahuasca group?
Yes. Good point. There was something specific. The researchers found that ayahuasca specifically seemed to increase emotional empathy, particularly towards negative stimuli.
Okay, so not just general empathy, but specifically relating to negative emotions in others.
That's what they found. A heightened ability to connect with and understand negative feelings.
That's fascinating. It sort of hints that ayahuasca might have a unique pharmacological effect on how we perceive and process difficult emotions in other people.
Could have big implications, potentially, for conditions where empathy is challenging.
Definitely something to explore further. Now, what about the psychedelic experience itself? Was it intense?
Well, that's another interesting bit. The subjective psychedelic effects reported by both groups were actually kind of low.
Oh.
Relatively low.
Even in the ayahuasca group?
Yeah. The researchers thought maybe the DMT doses in the capsules were lower than what you'd typically find in, say, clinical studies using pure DMT or stronger brews.
That makes sense. It highlights a challenge, doesn't it?
Right.
Trying to standardize something like ayahuasca in a capsule, especially in a less controlled retreat setting versus a lab.
Absolutely. Dose could be a key factor.
So the big takeaway from this study then, it seems like mental health improvements in these settings are probably a mix.
Yeah, it looks like it. It's likely not just the ayahuasca. There's this real interplay happening between the drug's effects and all those non-drug factors, the set and the setting.
Right. It really drives home why we need these rigorous placebo-controlled studies for psychedelics. We've got to untangle the drug effects from the power of ritual and expectation.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, shifting gears slightly. We also looked at info from the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. They're like at the forefront of this stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely pioneers. They're doing incredible work looking into the therapeutic potential of, well, various psychedelics, not just ayahuasca.
Right, for psychiatric disorders, behavioral issues, but also for potentially like enhancing well-being in healthy people too.
Taking a really broad view.
They specifically mentioned their psilocybin research, magic mushrooms, showing it can be safe in controlled settings and has potential for things like reducing anxiety in cancer patients.
And helping people quit smoking when it's combined with therapy. That's a big one.
Yeah. So why bring this up in an ayahuasca deep dive?
Well, I think it provides really important context. It shows there's this broader scientific momentum, this growing interest in psychedelics as a class for therapy.
Okay, so it's part of a bigger picture.
Exactly. It shows that these compounds can alter brain function in ways that might relieve negative emotions, might help change behaviors. It validates the overall approach of exploring these substances for mental health.
Right. It sort of sets the stage for why there's so much curiosity around ayahuasca specifically.
And that leads us perfectly into our third source.
Yeah.
A big systematic literature review focused specifically on ayahuasca and psychological disorders.
Yeah, this one synthesizes a ton of research.
Yeah.
Gives us that wider perspective.
It starts by framing the problem, right? Rising rates of anxiety, depression globally.
And the fact that many people just don't have easy access to mental health care.
Which makes exploring new, potentially effective options really urgent.
Then it goes into the history. Their traditional use by indigenous groups in Peru for millennia.
And what's key there, I think, is the emphasis that it wasn't just about drinking a brew. It was embedded in this really rich ceremony.
Guided by a curandero, a shaman.
Often in a group with specific music, the Icaros.
Right, and special diets, plant baths, all these other elements.
Even the purging, the vomiting, that was seen as part of the healing, not just a side effect.
It's such a different framework than just, taking a pill. The ritual, the community, it seems totally central to how it was traditionally understood.
Absolutely. And the review definitely highlights the range of potential therapeutic effects that modern research is now looking at. Antidepressant effects.
Anti-addiction.
Anti-anxiety properties, yeah. Plus, improvements in general, well-being, mindfulness, quality of life.
And it touches on potential for PTSD and eating disorders too, though maybe less researched.
Right. So let's try and unpack the how. The review gets into the biochemistry, the mechanisms of action. It gets a bit technical, but it's kind of crucial.
Okay, let's try.
So the main psychoactive bit, DMT, it messes with serotonin receptors, primarily 5-HT1A, 2A, and 2C.
And serotonin is huge for mood, stress. Right.
Exactly. It's a key neurotransmitter for emotional regulation, even neuroprotection. Think of it like a critical messenger for how we feel.
Okay. But ayahuasca isn't just DMT. There are those other compounds, the ballcarbolines, harmaline.
Right. And they do different things. They act as MAOI inhibitors. Basically, they stop an enzyme that breaks down serotonin. So more serotonin hangs around in the brain for longer.
Okay, boosting serotonin levels.
Yeah. And they also seem to block serotonin reuptake, kind of like some standard antidepressants, but through a different mechanism. Plus, there's evidence they might increase levels of other important things, like BDNF.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, good for brain health, growth.
Exactly. And VEGF, involved in blood vessel formation, both are really important for brain plasticity and health.
So the idea is more serotonin, more of these growth factors that could explain the antidepressant effects people report.
That's definitely a leading hypothesis. But it doesn't stop there. The review also mentions effects on dopamine pathways.
Dopamine. Motivation, pleasure.
Potentially, yeah. So maybe increasing motivation, reducing that inability to feel pleasure and hedonia, which is so common in depression.
Wow, it's like it's hitting multiple systems.
It really seems like it. There's mention of glutamatergic effects too, via those 5-HT1A receptors again, and even hitting sigma-1 receptors.
Sigma-1. What's that involved in?
It's complex, but it seems to play roles in memory, modulating fear responses, potentially relevant for trauma.
It's just the breadth of these biochemical targets is kind of amazing. It's not just one pathway.
No, it seems to be a complex interaction across different neurochemical systems. And the review even touches on neuroendocrine effects, potentially helping normalize the HPA axis, our main stress response system.
Regulating cortisol, maybe?
That's the idea. And maybe affecting growth hormone, prolactin. Plus, potential anti-inflammatory effects, too. They mention reductions in CRP, C-reactive protein.
So it's not just in the head, it's potentially affecting the body's stress and inflammation systems, too.
That seems to be the case, yeah. Now, moving beyond just the chemicals, what about brain activity? The review looks at EEG studies.
Right, measuring brain waves during the experience.
Yeah. And they find this characteristic pattern. Alpha waves decrease, but delta and gamma waves increase.
Okay, less alpha, more delta and gamma. Is gamma important?
It seems to be. That increase in gamma power, especially, is often linked to those really profound mystical experiences people talk about.
Feelings of unity, oneness, transcendence.
Exactly, those kinds of things. Research suggests there might be a neurological basis for these incredibly deep, subjective states. The review points out that higher gamma power seems to correlate with how intense these mystical experiences are.
So a connection between brain activity and the subjective feeling.
Yes. And it also mentions that the overall organization of the brain's network seems to get temporarily disrupted, kind of shaken up.
Like hitting a reset button.
Some researchers hypothesize that, yeah. That disruption might create a window, a period of increased flexibility where new connections, new ways of thinking can form.
It is a really compelling idea, a temporary rewiring. Okay, let's talk more about these mystical experiences. They seem to pop up again and again as being really important.
They really do. There's no single definition everyone agrees on, but generally they involve that sense of unity, interconnectedness.
Deep insights.
Yeah, feelings of profound insight, a sense of timelessness, altered reality perception. The review really emphasizes that these experiences, which are common with ayahuasca, might be a major contributor to the antidepressant effects.
And didn't the review mention a specific finding about that? Like a correlation?
Yes, a negative correlation. Basically, the more intense the mystical experience someone reported, the bigger the drop in their depression scores afterwards.
Wow. So the depth of that experience seems directly linked to the therapeutic outcome for depression.
It strongly suggests that. And like we said, the gamma wave increase seems to track with the intensity of the mystical experience too, strengthening that link between the subjective state and the brain changes.
Okay, what about anxiety? Another huge issue. Does ayahuasca help with that?
Well, the picture for anxiety, according to the review, is a bit murkier, less clear-cut than for depression.
Oh. How so?
Some regular users do report lower anxiety levels generally in their lives, but when you look at studies specifically designed to treat diagnosed anxiety disorders, the results are more mixed.
So, not consistently positive.
Some studies show symptom reduction, and again, a link between the mystical experience and anxiety reduction, but others found no significant long-term difference compared to controls, or even for some people, a temporary increase in anxiety.
Right. I mean, the experience itself can be anxiety-provoking for some, presumably.
Exactly. Yeah. So it might not be a straightforward fix for everyone with anxiety. The potential for the experience to induce anxiety, at least in the short term, is definitely something to consider carefully.
So more research needed there, specifically on anxiety disorders.
Definitely. The review stresses the need for more well-designed, controlled trials focusing on people with diagnosed anxiety conditions.
Okay. Let's pivot to substance abuse. This is an area where ayahuasca has shown some promising signs, right?
Yes, the review highlights that. People who use ayahuasca regularly tend to report drinking less alcohol, smoking less tobacco, compared to people who use other psychedelics.
That's interesting. Why might that be?
Well, one idea, perhaps counterintuitively, is that the challenging aspects of ayahuasca, the nausea, the purging,
the less pleasurable side effects.
Right. They might actually contribute to the therapeutic effect on addiction.
How? By creating like a negative association,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe bringing up difficult emotions tied to the addiction.
Both are possibilities, bringing repressed stuff to the surface to be processed. Also, the review points to the importance of the context, particularly the religious or spiritual settings like the UDV churches in Brazil.
So the structure, the community support, that matters a lot for addiction recovery with ayahuasca.
It appears to be very important for getting those benefits. And guess what else is a predictor for quitting smoking?
Let me guess. The mystical experience.
You got it. Seems to be a significant factor there, too.
So again, it's likely the whole package. The drug, yes, but also the ritual, the support, the meaning-making, even the difficulty of it.
That really seems key for addiction. Now, eating disorders, this is less researched, but the review touches on it.
Yeah, what's the thinking there?
Well, it mentions that ceremony leaders often feel ayahuasca helps people get to the emotional roots of their eating disorder.
Okay.
And participants themselves have reported, often anecdotally or in qualitative studies, that their symptoms reduced or even went away. They report feeling better about their bodies, higher self-worth, better able to process difficult emotions.
That's significant. What about the preparatory diet and the purging? Wouldn't that be triggering for someone with an eating disorder?
You'd think so, but interestingly, the review notes that within the ceremonial context, these aspects are often reframed. They're seen as energetic cleansing, not as restriction or punishment in the way the eating disorder might frame them.
So the meaning changes within the ritual.
Apparently so, for many. And people report sustained improvements in symptoms and emotional processing afterwards. It suggests ayahuasca might offer a unique way into the complex emotions behind eating disorders.
Seems promising, but needs more solid research, I guess.
Absolutely. The review is clear that a lot of the current evidence is qualitative interviews, observations. We need more rigorous clinical trials to really confirm these effects.
Okay. What about trauma? PTSD, childhood trauma, such difficult areas.
Yeah, and here the review says human studies on ayahuasca for PTSD are still pretty limited. A lot of what we have is anecdotal reports or theoretical ideas.
But what are the theoretical ideas? What's the potential mechanism?
The potential lies in ayahuasca possibly promoting lasting biochemical changes that support neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt.
Rewire itself.
Exactly. And also enhancing memory retrieval. The idea is this might help people reprocess traumatic memories in a new way, perhaps with less fear.
And didn't you mention that sigma-1 receptor earlier in relation to memory and fear?
Yes. The review brings that up again here, suggesting the sigma-1 receptor might be involved in mediating these potential trauma healing effects. But again, it's an area needing much more investigation.
Right. Lots of potential, but early days for solid evidence on PTSD specifically. This is also layered. The review also talks about personality changes.
It does. Some longitudinal studies following people over time suggest ayahuasca use might be linked to increases in openness and extroversion.
So more open to new experiences, more outgoing.
Potentially. And also decreases in neuroticism.
Less anxiety, moodiness, that kind of thing.
Right. And interestingly, the size of that decrease in neuroticism in some studies was apparently comparable to what you might see after quite a bit of standard therapy.
Wow. And let me guess again. Mystical experience involved.
You're catching on. Yes, the mystical experience seems to correlate with the biggest personality shifts, especially fostering more self-love and acceptance.
It really points to the potential for quite deep, lasting personal change through these experiences. What about thinking cognition?
Yeah, the review touches on that too. It suggests ayahuasca might enhance creative divergent thinking, generating lots of different ideas.
Brainstorming power.
Kind of. But it might decrease convergent thinking, which is more about finding the single right answer.
Interesting trade-off. And how does this link to brain networks?
Well, fMRI studies looking at brain activity suggest these cognitive shifts might be related to changes in how key brain networks connect and communicate, particularly the default mode network.
Involved in self-thought, mind-wandering.
Right. And the central executive network for focus and the salience network for picking out what's important. Changes in the interplay between these networks are thought to contribute to something called decentering.
Decentering. What's that?
Its evidence suggests it can, yes. Aspects like awareness, non-judgment, not reacting automatically to feelings, these seem to increase. And that sense of ego dissolution, the temporary loss of self during the peak experience, that seems particularly associated with longer-term increases in mindfulness.
Huh. The review even draws parallels, doesn't it? Between ayahuasca ceremonies and things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT.
It does, suggesting they both, maybe through different routes, foster that same kind of non-judgmental awareness of your own mental states.
Fascinating. It's like it might facilitate a psychological process similar to established therapies.
That's a really interesting possibility. And finally, the review really hammers home the importance of the ritual in the social setting. It's not just the brew.
We keep coming back to that, don't we?
Absolutely. All the different contexts, Brazilian churches, shamanic tourism, neo-shamanic groups, they all shape the experience and the outcomes. And that placebo study we started with.
Right, showed how powerful those non-drug factors are.
Exactly. Set and setting are not just minor details. They seem to be major players in the effects people experience.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this deep dive up. It seems like ayahuasca has this really complex mix of effects. There's the pharmacology, the drug interacting with the brain.
Which does seem to have specific effects, like increasing empathy, and shows potential across a range of conditions through all those biochemical pathways we talked about. Serotonin, dopamine, BDNF, maybe inflammation.
But then you absolutely cannot ignore the huge influence of the person's mindset, the environment, the ritual.
Right. Those non-pharmacological factors are clearly contributing significantly to the positive outcomes people report, as that placebo effect in the retreat study showed so clearly.
And woven through it all is this recurring theme of the mystical experience. That profound, often transformative, subjective state seems really key to many of the benefits, from depression relief to personality change.
It really does. So thinking about ayahuasca's potential requires this holistic view, doesn't it? You have to consider the biology and the context. They seem inseparable.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe a provocative one for our listeners. Given what we've learned, the potential of the substance itself, but also the undeniable impact of things like intention, setting, and ritual, how could we, maybe, better integrate both sides of this kind?
You mean integrate the biological and the contextual?
Yeah. In future approaches to mental health, to well-being, whether we're talking about psychedelics or even other kinds of therapies, what role could intentionality, maybe even ritual, play in our own journeys of self-discovery, of healing?
That's a big question. Definitely something to mull over.
It is. A lot to consider. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.